As a hostage in Beirut, I was a victim of an ancient conflict. In captivity, I read the Bible through twice. The battles fought there over the rights to the ownership of the land of Israel had a distinct relevance for me. But I've been discovering making this series that the past itself is actually a battlefield.
So far I've been told that despite what it says in the Bible, the evidence indicates that the Israelites did not come from Egypt and conquer Canaan, that they emerged from the local population, and that there is no trace of a city in Jerusalem in the days of David and Solomon.
The reason why some people don't accept that there was a Solomonic city in Jerusalem in the 10th century is because it's in the Bible. The Bible is suspect.
Jerusalem was probably a very poor village.
For many Israelis, the Hebrew Bible is the constitution of the modern state, and to question that, it's questioning Israel's right to exist.
Jerusalem, where there's almost no evidence for the 10th century.
To speak about evidence, the absence of evidence, as proof is ridiculous.
Don't use the Bible. Leave the Bible at home, please. You can come back to it later.
If you work without the Bible, all you're left with is dry bones and pots and pans. Who wants it?
The row over what is and is not true in the Bible can really wreck people's lives. That's why I've come here to King Solomon's mines. So here we are at King Solomon's mines.
May I correct you? You are at mines, but there were no King Solomon's mines. Not here and not anywhere else in the region.
The age of King Solomon is recorded in the Bible as the one time when an Israelite king ruled the whole land and it was at peace.
He had peace on all sides round about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon.
Benno Rothenberg began the process of undermining the myths when he excavated Timnah at the southern tip of Israel. The mines here were supposed to give Solomon his fabulous wealth.
And of course, King Solomon's mines is a wonderful story. You look at a shrine or a temple built by the Egyptian mining expeditions. This is not 10th century, this means Solomonic. This is 13th, 12th century, late bronze pottery. And then that's where my trouble started, because I was then saying, directly and indirectly, that there is no King Solomon in the area. There was a conference in Eilat in 1962 all the archaeologists were there, and I was not allowed to lecture.
The odd thing is that King Solomon's mines don't even appear in the Bible. They're just a 19th century story. But this was seen as an attack on King Solomon himself, and Rothenberg was silenced by the establishment.
It was against the biblical archaeology concept. And then they hated me because I was successful, because I could prove by thousands of material finds in the temple, including inscriptions. There was no argument about it because the king's name, and they were dated long before King Solomon, hundreds of years before Solomon. I had actually to leave Israel universities and go abroad because of this impossible personal situation.
But the climate has changed, and Benno Rothenberg is back in Israel. It's King Solomon who's on the defensive now.
We have no evidence at all for Solomon and his kingdom. We have no textual sources which mention Solomon, contemporary textual sources which mention Solomon, and as far as I'm aware, he's not referred to in any other outside contemporary texts.
This is Megiddo, a city said in the Bible to have been rebuilt by Solomon. When these structures were excavated in the 1930s, they were identified as King Solomon's stables.
Well, in the first instance, they probably weren't Solomon's. And the second instance, they probably weren't stables.
Ah, because we have what seem to be troughs here. What do you reckon they were?
Well, we have problems with these stables. There's no drainage under them. There's no way to bring the requisite hay, the requisite water up for the horses without an intense investment of labor. And most of the troughs are incomplete. They're broken on the ends. They have channels cut through them. This particular trough even has weights associated with it.
Right.
So how can a clever archaeologist explain this site?
Not a single horse bone has come out of this site so far. So what we're looking for is some sort of viscous liquid that would not leak out of the broken troughs.
Right.
Presumably something that needed to be pressed into patties, something that could be processed in one of these troughs and cut into perhaps cakes, removed for export without clay vessels. Something on the order of opium comes to mind to me.
So the ancient Israelite kings, if they were Israelites, were basically drug runners, you reckon?
That's my wish fulfillment scenario, yeah. I really hope that that's the case. But we do have evidence for the export of drugs from this area during the heyday of the Assyrian Empire, so that it's not entirely fantasy.
There were certainly poppies in the area. They are shown on later Jewish coins.
If it wasn't Solomon, who was it then? Who built this?
Well, this particular unit, these stables, come from a period that is generally assigned to the 9th century BC, contemporary with Ahab, more or less.
I happened to be at another excavation the next day, the ancient city of Hatzor, when they discovered something very surprising, at a level of the same date as those stone troughs.
See, that's a nice one. It's a pity it's here. I'm gonna look. I think we only found one of these in all of the years of Hatzor, but this is more beautiful. But we will not clean it now. We'll take it outside.
Could it possibly be a pipe? According to the Bible, King Solomon rebuilt 3 cities, Gezer, Hatzor and Megiddo. In the 1950s, an Israeli archaeologist found these complex gatehouses in all 3 and announced they were King Solomon's gates. This is the one at Hatzor. And this at Megiddo. But King Solomon is having this gate confiscated.
So, David, this is the King Solomon's Gate, as it's called here at Megiddo. Is it really his gate?
There is a problem here because the gate is connected and built together with a city wall, which is later in date and dates to the later period of the Israelite monarchy, to the end of the 9th or even the 8th century BC, much later than Solomon. The gate was built together with the wall, and this is quite clear, and therefore the gate is later. And I feel that King Solomon probably turns in his grave whenever he listens that the gate is ascribed to him.
Oh well, he's lost his stables and he's lost his gate, but at least he still has his palace here.
Well, this is a palace, in fact, which is quite a big one. It's about 30 meters long and 20 meters wide, which is kind of a large building. Yeah. And it was excavated, part of it was excavated by Yigal Yadin in the 60s.
Right.
And he identified it as a palace, rightly so. And he also dated it to the time of Solomon.
Aha. Was he right?
Well, the way I understand it, it was built in the 9th century, in the beginning of the 9th century, the time of the northern kingdom of Israel, when the northern kingdom was ruled from Samaria, probably in a time of King Ahab.
Ahab again. He's the king of the stables. Sorry, opium factory. King of the gates and king of the palace. So who is King Ahab? According to the Bible, Solomon was a very special king.
The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "Ask what I shall give thee."
Solomon asked for the power of judgment. The judgment of Solomon is legendary. He could tell the true mother of a baby by ordering it to be cut in 2. The baby remained whole. It was his kingdom that was split in 2. Good judge, bad ruler. The moment he died, the kingdom split. About 50 years later, Ahab became the ruler of the northern kingdom, called Israel or Samaria. And if what Finkelstein and Ussishkin say is true, Solomon's empire, ruled from Jerusalem in the 10th century BC, turns into a fable, a fantasy. The massive stone blocks were put there for Ahab and his father Omri. In Solomon's day, according to Israel Finkelstein, the king of Megiddo made do with mud bricks and big pebbles.
Yes, indeed, this city is a city from the period of David and Solomon. However, as far as I can understand it, it's not a city of David and Solomon.
Okay.
We are here in the last breath of the Canaanite world. We don't really have states here. In the 10th century, although it's always possible to argue that there was one state, centered in Jerusalem and so on, it's kind of difficult.
Of course, Solomon's kingdom would not be in doubt if there was evidence of his palace and his temple in Jerusalem, but there isn't.
We have not a stone of Solomon's temple. We have the descriptions of Solomon's temple, but we have not a stone of it.
Solomon's temple should have been the heart of his kingdom, but it can't even be looked for.
If there are any remains buried under the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's exactly where they'll stay. What exactly convinced some archaeologists that the fine buildings that had been thought to be Solomon's really belonged to a later period? The answer is pottery. Up until 1990, it was believed that if you found this kind of pottery on a site, you were looking at something made in the days of King Solomon. Why? Well, mainly, apparently, because it was found in the remains of buildings which everyone thought were built by Solomon. But in 1990, David Ussishkin began to excavate at Tel Yisrael, a few miles from Megiddo, the summer palace of Ahab and his wife.
Jezreel was the main fortified main fort of King Omri and King Ahab. It was obviously their main military center, and one can see that it's built on a very dominating position, dominating the main road and the valley of Jezreel.
These are the first Israelite kings whose names appear outside the Bible. Omri and his son Ahab are named as oppressors of the Moabites on this inscription, and Ahab is listed as one of the Assyrians' most powerful enemies.
They're not as famous as Solomon, but you might have heard of Ahab's wife, Jezebel.
She brought disaster on everyone, and in the process, it turns out, she provided the evidence that has so damaged Solomon. These children from Israel are hearing the Bible story of what Jezebel did to Naboth. He had a vineyard next to the palace. Ahab wanted the vineyard, Naboth wouldn't sell it. So to cheer up her husband, Jezebel had Naboth executed on false charges, and the king was given his property. Not a nice person. There's no vineyard to be seen now, but there is evidence that there really were vines next to the palace.
When archaeologists excavated the site, they found here in this cave containers for wine, old wine vessels. And the theory is that behind me here they pressed the grapes, the wine ran down across these stones, they collected the wine and then stored it in there.
The Bible records a sense of outrage. About a month later, Ahab was killed in battle, and soon after that, Jezreel was destroyed, along with Jezebel. The Assyrian ruler Shalmaneser III does record defeating Ahab in battle, though he didn't mention that he was doing it as Naboth's avenger. Jezebel may have been a bad thing from some points of view, but she performed a great service for archaeology. She brought about the destruction of Jezreel at a known date, so its pottery can be dated. No wonder the excavator is her greatest fan.
I'm always saying jokingly to my wife that a woman who is willing to murder because she sees her husband is in bad mood is an exemplary lady and should be followed.
The destruction that befell her, and therefore the pottery finds at the dig, could be accurately dated. Sam Moorhead was in charge of recording the finds.
The
Pottery that we found at Jezreel on the floors of the site can be dated quite closely to the destruction of the site, to the 840s.
Right.
The significance is it's the same pottery that was supposed to have been Solomonic at Megiddo.
Across the plain of Jezreel, 10 miles away, is the mound that is Tel Megiddo. The message being sent there was dynamite. They had found pottery from the century after Solomon, and it was the same as the pottery from the great palace at Megiddo. So that palace was not from the age of Solomon. There had been no mighty Israelite empire in the 10th century. Many people disagree very strongly. The distance between Solomon and Ahab is only 100 years. They don't accept that a certain kind of pottery used in the reign of one king was not used under the other.
I believe that this pottery has a long life, that it started in the 10th century and continued into the 9th century. What is the difference between the 10th century and the 9th century? I mean, 10th century and 9th century are just numbers, and the people at the year 900 BC, I mean, 1st of January 900 BC, they didn't realize that they are moving from the 10th to the 9th.
But where's the evidence? Can Mazar find that sort of pottery in a site that unquestionably dates from the time of Solomon? He's searching a few miles from Megiddo at Tel Rehoth.
So what have we got here?
Well, for example, you can see here, this is one of 6 goblets, or we call them chalices. They were found today along the walls, and we just washed it. It's before even restoration. You can see, for example, that this piece fits. I'm not a good restorer, I must say. Where does it come? Oh, here, you see? This is the foot, and it will be a nice goblet. We have all the pieces. We shall complete it in a few days. There is a leg here, a foot, and we found 6 of them along a wall. And this is a typical vessel to this time of the 10th and 9th centuries BC.
You can tell if one jar is older than another, but that doesn't give you an actual date. If you find organic material, seeds or wood, with the pottery, that can be scientifically dated, a process called carbon-14 dating.
We found a large heap of grain under brick collapse, so it was a very sealed context. We analyzed this grain in carbon-14 laboratories, 2 different laboratories, and they gave us a date between 900 and 830 BC.
The problem is that carbon-14 dating doesn't give you an exact year. You can just say that it is 98% probable that the date lies in a certain period, and that's what's happened here.
Unfortunately, the span of carbon-14 goes all the way from Solomon to Ahab, exactly this time. So we are in trouble.
Here's the trouble. The bottom part of this room contains the pottery in question. Then the room filled with rubbish, and a new room was built on top, with more of the same pottery. How long did that take? Mazar is sure the original room must date back to the 10th century, the time of Solomon.
My good friend Israel Finkelstein would claim that all these 2 levels probably are dated to the 9th century BC, because in his view, all this pottery that appears in the lower level here cannot be 10th century. It has to be 9th century. In my view, I cannot condense all this huge stratigraphy, all these phases, into a time period of less than 70 years.
If Amichai Mazar is right, the pottery from the great palace at Megiddo and the palace itself can be associated with Solomon. So what's the truth? Maybe what matters is that even Mazar talks about Solomon as a much less powerful ruler than the Bible describes.
The important point here is what is a reflection of this excavation, as well as other sites, on our general assessment of this monarchy. I, for example, don't believe that it was as glorious as it is described in the Bible. Definitely not. It was much smaller and much less glorious and strong than we may imagine by reading the stories about David and Solomon.
But how much smaller? Perhaps Solomon was nothing more than a mythologized local chieftain. It all comes back to Jerusalem.
Is it possible that sites with monumental architecture were ruled from a city, from a town, Jerusalem, where there's almost no evidence for the 10th century? There's almost no evidence for Solomon. So Jerusalem was probably a very poor village or a very small town at the town, and here we have this monumental architecture. Doesn't sound right.
There's one group of people in Israel who have their own version of history, which may explain how there could have been a real Solomon without a great capital city in Jerusalem. This is the annual Passover ceremony of the Samaritans, people who claim to be descended from the original inhabitants of Ahab's kingdom of Israel or Samaria, the kingdom that was destroyed by the Assyrians in 721 BC. If you're looking for the lost tribes of Israel, this is the place to look. Here on Mount Gerizim. In Jewish tradition, Jerusalem, the mountain where Solomon built his temple, was where Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac. And that's where the great Passover sacrifices were held. But the Samaritans make the sacrifice here and believe that Jerusalem was not particularly important until long after Solomon. When Samaria, the northern kingdom of Israel, was destroyed by the Assyrians, refugees seem to have poured into the southern kingdom of Judah, suddenly swelling the population of Jerusalem. Then Judah was smashed by the Babylonians and Jerusalem destroyed. The Jews were dispersed, and then, 70 years later, they were allowed to return to build a new second temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans, heirs of the northern kingdom, still maintain that when that happened, the traditions associated with their own sacred site were transferred, lock, stock and barrel, to Jerusalem. They believe there was a Solomon, but reject the books of the Bible that describe Jerusalem as their capital city. The Samaritan version of history now has some academic support.
People composing the biblical stories in the period of, let's say, the Babylonian exile would have seen Jerusalem in its heyday, in the golden age, as it were, as being the capital city. And I'm sure that's where the tradition comes from.
No one can be sure if there really was a Solomon or if he really had a temple.
This is the Shrine of the Book, built to celebrate the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Until they were found, the earliest version of the Old Testament was 1,000 years old. These are 1,000 years older than that. But stories such as Solomon and his temple belong yet another 1,000 years back.
Were they written by eyewitnesses, journalists, historians? Or were they rewritten or made up centuries later by people trying to teach whatever version of history they wanted to be believed?
Next week, I hope to get closer to an answer.